You're listening to a podcast powered by WOBI.
Hello and welcome to the WOBI Podcast, where we uncover ideas, stories, and strategies that inspire leaders and empower companies to evolve, thrive, and make a lasting, positive impact. My name is Sophia, and I'll be your host for this episode. Today, we're exploring a case of success that reminds us that sometimes, and just sometimes, the sky is not the limit, but the starting point. Since ancient times, we have looked at the stars with fascination and wonder. For centuries, space represented the ultimate impossible. Until one day, the stars were no longer out of reach. What began as a dream became a mission. And over time, that mission turned into an entire industry. In fact, a joint report by the World Economic Forum and McKinsey suggests that the global space economy could expand from around $630 billion in 2023 to $1.8 trillion by 2035. But before we look ahead, let's rewind to the start of the 21st century when a new moonshot company, if ever there was one, entered the game and changed it forever. And to learn about it, our guest for today is Andrew McAfee, Principal Research Scientist at MIT and one of the world's leading thinkers on technology and innovation. McAfee proudly describes himself as a geek because he believes that geeks all over the world have discovered a fundamentally different and better way of doing business. In this episode, Andy will walk us through one of the most powerful examples of this way of operating in action. The case of SpaceX, a geek company that, despite being a newcomer in historical terms, achieved what no one else in the space industry had managed to do. I won't keep you waiting any longer. Here is Andrew McAfee telling the story of SpaceX.
One of the most knowledge-intensive, capital-intensive industries on the planet, doing maybe the most difficult thing that we human beings have ever accomplished, which is putting human beings into space. So let's talk about SpaceX. SpaceX was founded this century. SpaceX was founded in 2002. And it was founded by a very interesting person who thought that we human beings needed to become an interplanetary species. That was the vision behind SpaceX. Now, to become an interplanetary species, we need rockets to go up into space. Building a rocket that can get up into space, one of the most difficult science and engineering and manufacturing challenges that we have ever faced. And in 2002, everybody in the space industry, everybody knew that if you could build reusable rockets, your cost would go down. Everybody knew that. Nobody had accomplished it. SpaceX became the first company to relaunch a commercially viable orbital rocket. They did that in 2016. Another way to say that is less than 15 years after the company was founded, it did something nobody else in the space industry had ever done. SpaceX did the first commercially viable orbital relaunch. The rest of the industry so far has done zero. One of the other things that they realized was that people like to communicate, and you can actually use satellites for communication. Now, again, they were not the first company to realize this. Everybody in the space industry realized this. And at that time, the commercial satellite industry was over half a century old. But SpaceX comes along and says, we're going to provide cheap internet bandwidth to everybody all around the world from space. They launched the Starlink rockets. They've got millions of customers in about 100 countries around the world. It kind of makes me wonder, what has everybody else in this industry been doing? They still weren't finished. The most recent thing that SpaceX has done is they are now the only organization certified by NASA to take American astronauts into space. They achieved that in 2020. The story behind this, behind the Dragon Crew spacecraft, is actually really interesting, and it tells me a lot about the competitive battles between old-fashioned companies, kinds of companies that we built in the course of the 20th century, and this new style of companies. I call them geek companies. So let's look at SpaceX and Boeing going head-to-head, starting from the same point in time, and trying to build a spacecraft to take human beings into space. When NASA ended the space shuttle program in 2011, America no longer had the ability to put its own astronauts into space. And for many reasons, we thought this is a problem. So in 2014, NASA launched a program to have private companies build a spacecraft. And they selected two companies, SpaceX and Boeing. Everybody knows Boeing. It builds airplanes, it builds rockets, it builds satellites. It had amazing knowledge about the aerospace industry. So they gave them both a contract in 2014 to build a spacecraft. Boeing's was about 60% bigger than SpaceX's. But to get certified to put humans into space, you have to pass a series of tests. The first one is, can you stop the launch on the landing pad? SpaceX satisfied that requirement very quickly in 2015. It took Boeing a lot longer. The second test was, can you put a spacecraft without any people on it up into orbit and do that successfully? SpaceX passed that. Boeing did it many years later. The third and final big test was to put human beings in the spacecraft, send them up into space, bring them back down successfully. SpaceX did that in 2020, and they became the first American organization to get certified to put astronauts into space. And then they started doing that over and over. And SpaceX has done about 15 of those so far. If you remember, there were 2 astronauts who went up to the International Space Station on a Boeing spacecraft. Oh, great, they passed the test. The problem was, when NASA looked at the data from that flight, they said to Boeing, you are not bringing those astronauts home. That was extremely unsafe. We do not trust you, Boeing, to bring those astronauts home. So this is a very bad day in the history of Boeing, when NASA announced that they were not allowed to bring those astronauts back home, and that instead, SpaceX, founded in 2002, was going to bring those astronauts home, which is exactly what happened. This, to me, it's an incredible story, but it's also, the more I look, the more I think it's a typical story about what happens when these old-fashioned companies compete against the geeks. It is a very, very lopsided competition.
So, what's the real moral of this story? It's not just about SpaceX's technology, teams, or dreams. What made SpaceX succeed where Boeing and others fell behind was a completely different way of operating. A mindset built on ownership instead of hierarchy, on openness instead of defensiveness, on evidence instead of opinions, and on speed, not as rushing, but as learning, iterating, and improving. This is what Andrew McAfee calls the Geek Way, a culture where decisions are pushed down, where truth can challenge power, where the best data wins the argument, and where progress comes from learning faster than the competition. To wrap up, here's the question I'll leave you with. How could thinking like a geek unlock growth, spark innovation, or create a real competitive edge in your organization? Thanks so much for listening. It's always great to have you with us. And remember that if you enjoyed this episode, this is just the tip of the iceberg of everything you can see, read, and listen to through the WOBI app. Join WOBI and discover much, much more. We'll catch up again soon in our next episode. Until next time, take care and goodbye.